All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 70 for January 2025. Happy 200th birthday to several of our residents. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1836 and remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West, located across the Schuylkill River in Ballackinwood, was founded in 1869. It has a history and a population of its own. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. As we hurtle toward the country's 250th birthday, I reflect on several Laurel Hill East residents who would be celebrating their 200th birthday in 2025. Months ago, I recruited a couple of fellow guides to help with this massive project, and unfortunately, both of them ran into some last-minute emergencies. If they get their recordings to me before January 1st, I will include them in the full podcast recording. Otherwise, I will release them as separate vignettes as I receive them. So what was happening in 1825? Well, John Quincy Adams was sworn in as the 6th president. The first modern railway opened in England. The Erie Canal opened in New York State. And Bolivia granted its independence from Spain. In Philadelphia, Thomas Craycroft was a Philadelphia medical student who volunteered to help in the 1855 yellow fever epidemic in Norfolk, Virginia. He was one of 15 Philadelphians who died during that mission of mercy, but whose remains are now interred under the Yellow Fever Monument at Laurel Hill East. Edwin Henry Fitler made his fortune in rope at a time when Philadelphia had one of the busiest shipyards in the country. He was the first Philadelphia mayor to conduct his business from an office at City Hall in the years that it was being completed. Fitler is the namesake for Fitler Square, and his obelisk is the tallest at Laurel Hill East. Laura Matilda Towne was an abolitionist who studied homeopathic medicine and became an instructor for recently freed enslaved Africans on the islands off South Carolina. That turned into her life's work for the next 30 years. U.S. Military Academy graduate Richard H. Rush was the son of a man who had served as a cabinet member of 3 different presidencies and grandson of 2 signers of the Declaration. Early in the Civil War, Rush mustered a cavalry regiment of friends and neighbors. They called themselves Rush's Lancers. Fellow guide Russ Dodge tells that story. John Rowe was an inpatient at Blockley Almshouse in 1885 when a fire raced through his wing and killed more than a score of male psychiatric patients who were locked in their cells. John Rowe was one of the victims of that tragedy, and we're pretty sure he is interred in the family lot at Laurel Hill East. Private George Lafayette Washington carried the name of his great-uncle, America's first president. His wife was niece of the founder of Clemson University. Washington became a member of the Confederacy. He rode with Mosby's raiders before he was captured at Winchester, Virginia in September 1864. Confederate historian Sam Ricks tells you Washington's story. And Henry Charles Lee was a publisher, researcher, and author who wrote the definitive history of the Spanish Inquisition. His grave marker was sculpted by Alexander Sterling Calder and is one of the most photographed monuments on the property. I'm repeating his story. I originally told it in All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories number 18 a few years ago. These stories and much more in this month's episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 70. Happy 200th birthday. Thomas Craycroft, 1825-1855, for love of his fellow man. Even though it has been melting for more than a century and a half, the so-called Yellow Fever Monument in Section W of Laurel Hill East is still impressive. The design was by John Baird, master of marble, who more than 20 years later would build the scale model of the 1876 centennial celebration that presently lives in the basement of the Please Touch Museum in Fairmount Park. Baird, who was interred at Laurel Hill East, also constructed several mausoleums there. The monument was paid for with voluntary contributions from hundreds of Philadelphians. It marks the resting place of 13 men and 2 women who died while caring for victims of yellow fever during an 1855 epidemic in Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia. It is a Roman Doric column, 25 feet high, including the base and the pedestal, and except for a base of Pennsylvania marble, is constructed of the best Italian marble. The base measures 5 feet 6 inches square. It weighs more than 5 tons. On top of this rests the pedestal base with its richly carved moldings and appropriate inscriptions. The pedestal is a cube of 3 feet of the best Carrara marble. Each of the 4 panels is enriched with elaborate carvings in basso relievo. From the pedestal rises the fluted column with its molded base and graceful capital. The entire monument is surmounted by a shrouded urn. North face. The plinth of this column bears the inscription, "As for man, his days are as grass. As a flower of the field, so he flourisheth." Psalm 103:15. The pedestal has a carving in relief called "Laying Out the Dead," and the base of the pedestal bears the inscription, "Erected by the Philadelphia contributors in memory of the doctors, druggists, and nurses of this city who volunteered to aid the sufferers by yellow fever at Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, and died in the discharge of their duties, martyrs in the cause of humanity." The east face, the plinth of the column, bears the inscription, "If ye fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well." James 2:8. This pedestal has a relief carving of charity, and on the base of the pedestal is inscribed, "The pestilence to which those here entombed fell martyrs broke out at Portsmouth and Norfolk, Virginia, in July 1855, and prevailed with great malignancy during August, September, and the early part of October, attended by a mortality equal to anything hitherto observed in the United States." South face of the column, well, on the plinth, it's inscribed, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." Paul to Galatians 6:9. This pedestal has a carving of Hippocrates declining the bribe, and on the base of the pedestal is inscribed, "I was sick, and ye visited me. Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Matthew 25, 36, and 40. Finally, on the west face, the plinth of the column is inscribed, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. This pedestal has a carving of the Good Samaritan and a list of all the people who were interred there, whose ages ran from 19 to 55. Now, one of the victims, 35-year-old Singleton Mercer, had a notorious reputation. You've already heard about him. He's the one who in 1843 had slain the man about town Malin Hutchinson Heberton for seducing his younger sister. Fellow tour guide Thomas Keels told you that story in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 57, Murder Most Foul. He also told you about that in his book, Wicked Philadelphia. Now, just above Singleton Mercer's name is carved Dr. Thomas Craycroft, age 30. They listed him as a doctor. Craycroft was a medical student who nonetheless volunteered to help, and he lost his life in the process. The twin cities by the sea of Norfolk and Portsmouth were important ports in 1855. They generally saw about 1,500 ships annually. Norfolk is on the east bank of the Elizabeth River, opposite Portsmouth and Gosport near Hampton Roads, Cape Henry, and the Atlantic Ocean. The cities are nearly surrounded by the waters of the river and the marshy creeks. The climate of Norfolk and Portsmouth is relatively mild and agreeable throughout the year. The nearby ocean affects the temperature and allows mild winters. Summers are long and temperate, with an average temperature of 78.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and precipitation is well distributed throughout the year. In 1855, the population of Norfolk was 16,000, and that of Portsmouth about 10,000, with about a quarter of both cities being black inhabitants. Some were freedmen, some were enslaved. In 1855, Norfolk consisted of 185 clean, paved, and well-drained streets and lanes. As a result of its low elevation, it occasionally flooded. The commercial part of the city consisted of 40 warehouses and 10 wholesalers and grocers between Main Street and the river. Norfolk agents traded with New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, and Washington, D.C. The affluent citizens lived on Main Street east of Church Street or in the northwest section of the city. The poorer inhabitants lived crowded in tenements on West Main along Church Street, Bermuda, Hartshorn's Court, Holly Place, and in alleys off Water Street. Black residents lived in the north half of town. Barry's Row was a poor Irish neighborhood which had been built on man-made ground to prevent it from being reclaimed by the river. Portsmouth is southwest of Norfolk on the opposite side of the Elizabeth River. Gosport is south of Portsmouth, separated by a marshy creek. It had a population of 500 or 600, mostly Irish laborers and their families. Its main road, Water Street, runs from the creek to the Navy Yard. In 1855, both Portsmouth's and Gosport's streets were mostly unpaved and poorly drained. But on the Water Street front, where many workmen lived, the surface was clean and well drained. At the time, Portsmouth had little commerce, so there were only a few warehouses or ships at her wharves. On the 6th of June in 1855, the steamer Benjamin Franklin from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands pulled into port at Norfolk for repairs. It was known that yellow fever was prevalent in St. Thomas when she left, so the ship was quarantined, although the captain and the crew were allowed to visit the city. When the Norfolk health officer investigated 12 days later and found no cases of yellow fever on board, the ship was given permission to go upriver for the needed repairs. By the way, the term quarantine is derived from the Latin. It originally meant 40 days in isolation. On July 5th, a man from Richmond who had boarded the Benjamin Franklin to provide assistance was stricken with the disease and he died 4 days later. This caused panic in Portsmouth, and the town council ordered the ship to be sent out to quarantine the next day. But the disease had already begun to spread. Yellow fever is a viral disease. It spread mostly by the Aedes mosquito. It evolved in Africa, where it became endemic, and many Africans developed an acquired immunity. During the 19th century, people in much of the United States were familiar with yellow fever. There had been outbreaks in Philadelphia, New York, and New Orleans. Norfolk and Portsmouth had experienced their own outbreaks before in 1795, 1802, 1821, and 1826. And by the middle of the century, yellow fever had become the South's most feared illness. The cause of the disease was unknown at that time. Many people believed that a poor sanitation played a role in spreading the disease. In fact, the leaders of Norfolk delayed announcing the presence of yellow fever in the city because they didn't want to ruin its reputation as a clean, urban setting. The belief of uncleanliness as a cause of disease contributed to the prejudiced views toward poor immigrants who lived in less sanitary areas of the city. People also knew there was a connection between yellow fever and the weather. Citizens who left Norfolk and Portsmouth during the outbreak knew the yellow fever would be gone after the first frost, and that it would be safe to return. Now, people were aware of the presence of mosquitoes. They were pretty much unavoidable, but they never made any connection between the mosquitoes and the climate and the disease. And most people believed that it spread from person to person. But infected citizens who fled and later died of yellow fever did not spread the disease to the place where they had gone. There were many prior outbreaks in the New World. Some people actually called yellow fever the American plague. The Philadelphia epidemic in 1793 that I've talked about before caused the deaths of several thousand people, more than 9% of the population. Many of them were buried in what is now Washington Square and Franklin Square. The federal government, including President Washington, fled the city for Trenton, New Jersey. Benjamin Rush, preeminent physician in the New World, thought he'd solve the problem by performing vigorous bleeding of his patients and giving them calomel, mercuric chloride, and quinine for fever. Methods of treatment had not improved much in the intervening 52 years from when Benjamin Rush was treating Philadelphians for yellow fever in 1793. Symptoms of yellow fever begin after an incubation period of 3 to 6 days. Most people experience only mild flu-like symptoms: fever, headache, chills, backache, fatigue, loss of appetite, nausea. In these mild cases, the patients recover in a few days. But in 15% of cases of yellow fever, people enter a second toxic phase of the disease. It's characterized by recurring fever, this time accompanied by jaundice due to liver damage, as well as abdominal pain, mainly from the inflamed liver. Because the liver manufactures many factors that help our blood to clot, death of those cells led to spontaneous bleeding from the mouth, nose, eyes, and the GI tract. Partially digested blood looks very dark. It's the source of the so-called black vomit. Hence, one of the names in Spanish for yellow fever is vomito negro. There may also be kidney failure, hiccups, and delirium. The overall fatality rate of yellow fever is only 3 to 7.5%. But among those who develop jaundice, the fatality rate is 20% to 50% or higher. But victims who survive the infection have lifelong immunity and usually no permanent organ damage. We know now that the mosquito is the world's deadliest enemy, as it spreads diseases like malaria, dengue, West Nile, Zika, chikungunya, and lymphatic filariasis. Nearly 700 million people contract mosquito-borne illnesses each year, resulting in more than 1 million deaths. But this information was still several decades away. By mid-July 1855, yellow fever cases were reported in Norfolk. Barry's Row, the neighborhood nearest the port, reported the first cases. Many citizens fled the city in fear, but cities which had initially accepted the refugees soon had a change of heart, and they refused to accept any more. The Board of Health barricaded the Irish section and removed all the inhabitants. And on the 9th of August, the entire block of the Irish section burned to the ground, apparently in an attempt to control the disease. Hundreds of people were suddenly homeless. But of course, this didn't help. No one ever took responsibility for starting the fire either. Also remember that 1855 was sort of the height of the anti-Catholic, anti-immigration, know-nothing movement in the United States. And the prejudice against Irish in Virginia was no less than it had been in Philadelphia during the nativist riots. The fever continued to spread throughout the cities and beyond. Hundreds of people contracted the disease, and few survived. The wealthy areas of Norfolk suffered equally with the less sanitary, poorer areas. Authorities in both Norfolk and Portsmouth took all possible measures to stop the progress of the yellow fever. For example, the Howard Association, a local charity, transformed Norfolk's largest hotel into a hospital to care for the victims. In Portsmouth, the government gave up the Naval Hospital for care of the sick. The Relief Association was also set up to minister to those suffering. When the boards of health in Portsmouth and Norfolk finally confirmed on July 30th, yes, there was an epidemic, residents panicked, as was feared, and they fled the city. They jammed the ships and the trains. And within a few days, 1/3 of Norfolk's white residents had left, while almost none of the estimated 5,000 black residents, of which nearly 1,000 were free blacks, had the liberty or the means to leave. Remember, this is also at the height of the Fugitive Slave Act, and if a free black person were to wander out someplace, could easily be mistaken for an escaped enslaved person and captured and resold. Similarly, in Portsmouth, about 1/3 of the residents who had the means to leave town did so. Things got so bad toward the end of the summer that the only vessel allowed to enter the harbor was the steamer J.S. Coffee. It met boats outside Hampton Roads, and it brought fresh supplies of coffins. Once the coffins became scarce, mass graves were dug, and scores more were buried there. Now, not a lot of Philadelphians were still alive from their major epidemics of half a century earlier, but many from the Quaker City stepped forward to assist. Physicians, nurses, druggists, and others who felt they had to do something, and they had something to offer. On August 15, 1855, Philadelphia's Thomas Webster, Jr., of the newly formed Relief Society, wrote to Norfolk's mayor and enclosed a bank draft for $600 and a promise of help to come. When Webster put out word he was looking for volunteers, dozens of people stepped forward, including many physicians and medical students. Philadelphia was not the only city to send help in those days before FEMA and the Red Cross and the Salvation Army and other rescue organizations we now take for granted. Volunteers came from as far as upstate New York and New Orleans to care for victims in Virginia. At the start of the epidemic, Portsmouth had 10 regular physicians and 2 homeopathic practitioners. 9 of them caught the virus, and 4 of them died. The living physicians were almost at once overwhelmed. Citizens in Norfolk were dying at a rate of 60, 70, or even 80 people per day. In Portsmouth, the rate was 20 to 30 per day, and one Portsmouth physician was reported to have treated 100 patients in a single day while moving from house to house. The first frost of October brought an end to the illness, although nobody understood why. Volunteer doctors, nurses, and druggists boarded ships and trains to head home. Supply ships and those who had left town steamed back to their homes. The exact number of victims from the 1855 pandemic will never be known. One Portsmouth physician made an educated guess. Occupants who could leave the city did so. Of the 2,200 remaining white people, 2,100 caught the disease and 890 died, for a mortality rate of 42%. Enslaved Africans and African Americans and freedmen were unable to leave, and of the 1,800 blacks in the city, 1,700 were infected, but only 95 died. Mortality rate, 5%. In Norfolk, the numbers were similar. Norfolk had at least 21 physicians when the epidemic struck. All of them were infected. 11 recovered, 10 died. Physicians volunteered from up and down the East Coast. 45 doctors came to Norfolk. 25 of them died. 27 came to Portsmouth. 8 of them died. Women from across the country volunteered as nurses, many of them from areas also plagued by yellow fever, such as New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, Savannah. The Philadelphia Relief Commission sent 60 volunteers. 15 of them died. A medical student, 2 druggists, 2 doctors, a student, and 9 nurses. The medical student who died was Thomas Craycroft, about whom I can find virtually nothing, except that he was born in 1825. The Richmond Dispatch reported on August 25, 1855, that, quote, the Philadelphia Committee of Citizens charged with the collection and distribution of funds for the relief of the sufferers by the fever at Norfolk and Portsmouth yesterday sent off 6 volunteers from this city to act in the capacity of physicians and nurses. The physicians are Dr. Martin Reiser and Dr. Cortland Cole, with Thomas Craycroft, a student of medicine. The Craycroft family had come from England in the 17th century, with a large segment of the family ending up in Kentucky. But a search of my usual online sources, newspapers.com, ancestry.com, I come up dry. I could not even figure out if Thomas Craycroft was a student at Penn or Jeff, or one of the other medical students which had sprung up. I think there were 5 or maybe 6 of them in the city at this time, or whether he was learning by the older apprentice method and had followed his mentor down south to be helpful. It's also a bit unusual to find a 30-year-old in medical training. The only times I find his name are when he arrived in Virginia, when he died, and then the return of his body with the other 14 martyrs in 1859 after the monument was built at Laurel Hill. January 13th, 1859, Southern Argus. Headline, Removal of the Bodies of the Philadelphians, a Solemn Procession. Captain Nathan Thompson, an active agent of the Philadelphia Relief Society formed in that city in 1855, of which Thomas Webster, Jr., Esquire, was president, arrived a few days ago for the purpose of superintending the removal to Philadelphia of the sacred remains of those of that noble band of heroes who came to our relief from the above city in the summer of 1855 and fell at the post of duty, and whose names will ever stand inscribed on the roll of honor. Yesterday at 11 o'clock, the bodies were disinterred and a procession formed consisting of the Howard Association with the male orphans of the Howard Asylum, the Masonic Fraternity, and the Woodis Riflemen. This company numbering on the occasion about 50 men, although the notice to parade was very short, only a few hours. A band of music marched at the head of the procession. Captain Corprew, sergeant of the city, rode as marshal, and Mayor Lamb and others were in the line. The procession, moving slowly toward the steamer, presented a truly solemn scene, forcibly reminding many of other scenes witnessed when and where these heroes fell. They came in life and health with willing hearts and strong arms to our help when so greatly needed, and their crumbling remains only go back to be, quote, placed beneath the green sod at a well-chosen quiet spot within hearing of the solemn toll of the bell of their native city, there to be visited and cherished with fond remembrance by those who loved them well. End quote. A noble column it is that stands to mark the sacred spot where the remains of those brave, generous ones will find a permanent resting place. Tall, massive, and symmetrical, with suitable devices and inscriptions exquisitely carved in the pure native marble, it rises in its sad beauty, majestically above surrounding monumental stones and other evidences of affection and respect, amid trees and vines and flowers that give to Laurel Hall, that's the way it's spelled, that lovely city of the dead, a mysterious charm in its stillness and loveliness. Cold indeed must be the heart of him who can look unmoved upon that beautifully chiseled and appropriate monument erected by a people of a great city to the memory of those who came hither to battle with an unseen enemy that spared them not. The mortal remains of those gallant men who came forth to meet the foe and fell have been exhumed and are now returning over ocean's blue waves to a still more honored riverside where the hand of affection may plant a tree to wave and flowers to bloom over the cherished dust of your departed. Here the death mist settled over their eyes, and the weary ones sank down to unbroken rest and repose. There in the quiet sunlight, or beneath the shade of the evergreen, where the perfume-breathing blossoms will bloom in dew-bathed freshness, and while the evening star will look down in its cold, calm beauty, they will slumber on till the last waking. Thank you, Thomas Craycroft, for being a professional caregiver, one who runs toward the danger rather than away. Edwin Henry Fitler, 1825-1896, the Emperor of Rope. Have you ever worked a lot with rope? It's fascinating stuff. For most of 1971, I worked as a deckhand at a tugboat company on the Illinois River in Havana, Illinois. We maneuvered newly filled barges from docks at the grain elevators along the river into large tows that were headed downstream to Grafton and the mighty Mississippi. Or we would pick up a barge full of coal stored across the river and bring it to the coal-fired power plant. It always seemed like I had a length of rope in my hands, or at least nearby. And when we weren't pushing barges, the other deckhands and I would do maintenance work, including rope maintenance and repairs. I barely paid attention to the material that I was using, except to know that some of the ropes were made from plant fiber and others were made from man-made material. The man-made, the Dacron, the nylon, was lighter and smaller and easier to handle, but it was slippery when wet, even with gloves, and it was far more expensive. I also figured out very quickly that working in sub-freezing temperatures with waterlogged frozen hemp rope is something I wish on no one. It certainly was not a way to make a career. We would use rope to lash barges together, secure them to the dock, and move them around with the assistance of capstans and winches. I actually got pretty good with a lasso, hooking a corner post on a target barge and then using a capstan on the tug to leverage it into place. I even learned how to unbraid the end of a rope and make my own lasso, a skill that I lost many decades ago. Rope is essential on the water. Sailing ships with several masts and many sails need literally miles of rope to run. The three-masted clipper ship Cutty Sark, built in 1869, it's now a museum in Greenwich since 1954. It requires 11 miles of rope to function properly. An experienced seaman or an old salt will explain that manila rope is the best quality and it should be used when strength is critical, but it becomes almost impossibly heavy when it's waterlogged. Now, you can coat it with tar to make it water resistant and prolong its useful life. Sisal, derived from the agave plant, is pale and hairy. It can be coated in tar, but it only has about 80% of the strength of manila. Hemp is pale straw color, hard and smooth. It's heavier than manila and less flexible. Now, with practice, you can find many plants and vines in the wild and turn them into rope by hand twisting and manipulation. I found several videos on YouTube in which people take vines off of a plant. One of them uses a wisteria plant and makes a decent length of rope from scratch. It's fascinating to watch. Now, at sea, old rope doesn't get thrown away. Rope fibers teased out of old lengths no longer usable to pull or bind things is tarred and called okama, which is stuffed between the ship planks and held in place by caulk in order to waterproof. If you've read much Herman Melville or Dickens or Jack London or Mark Twain, you've probably read about sailors pulling oakum either as a task or as a punishment. Philadelphia was a huge shipbuilding town, even back before the Revolution. By 1720, there were already a dozen shipyards in Philadelphia and the surrounding waterfront, and they were producing wooden sailing ships of up to 300 tons. For a shipyard to thrive, it must have access to huge amounts of raw material and craftsmen, millers to produce masts, tailors to produce sailors, plus tar, caulk, paint, and rope. Lots of rope. Men who decided to make a living by manufacturing sailing accessories clustered by the Delaware River. Originally, hemp and flax were the only fibers used to manufacture rope. Manila hemp, sisal, ixtal, and jute came later. By 1899, there were 13 cordage factories in the Philadelphia area with an output valued at $6,162,000. Edwin Henry Fitler was born in Northern Liberties in December 1825, son of successful leather merchant and tanner William Fitler and his wife Elizabeth Wonderly Fitler. Young Edwin received an excellent academic education in the schools of the city. He initially planned to adopt the law as his profession, and he entered the office of Charles E. Lex, a prominent lawyer in Philadelphia, and no relation that I know of. That branch of the Lex family arrived years before my branch arrived in 1879. But after 4 years of legal study, Edwin decided that his natural tastes were for mechanical pursuits. When he was 21 years old, he took a job in the cordage house of his brother-in-law, George J. Weaver. This company had been founded by Michael Weaver in 1817 when cordage spinning, which is a fancy term for rope making, was carried on in the primitive way, and gangs of rigging were laid by hand. Sometimes the neighbors were actually called in to assist. Rope was woven in long, elevated, narrow troughs called rope walks. These troughs were often completely outdoors. Unlike most other industrial factories, rope walks were outside of cities because of the high fire risk that they posed. Hemp fibers are extremely flammable. Due to the extremely long lengths of rope that needed to be made, these factories were often around 1/4 of a mile long and sometimes longer. Some rope walks actually provided bicycles for workmen to get from one end to the other more quickly. In a rope walk, long fibers would be laid down and twisted together to make one long, strong rope. The strength of the rope comes from these fibers being wound together multiple times over. The more the weave, the stronger and the heavier the rope. 2 years after he joined the firm, Edwin was admitted to partnership, known first as George J. Weaver and Company, and later as Weaver, Fitler and Company, Philadelphia Cordage Works. They were at Germantown and 10th. He introduced labor-saving machinery, much of it his own invention. He never patented his inventions, so many were adopted by other cordage manufacturers. By 1870, he had purchased the interests of most of his other partners in the firm, and the name was changed to Edwin H. Fitler and Company, Philadelphia Cordage Work. His business grew, and he moved to 15 acres in the Bridesburg section of Philadelphia, where his factory was one of the largest cordage works in the United States. Cordage, or rigging, is divided into two classes: standing, which supports the mast, and running, which controls the orientation of the sails. Standing rigging is almost always between a mast and the deck, and it uses tension to hold the mast firmly in place. Nowadays, most standing rigging is made of steel cable. It was historically made of the same materials as running rigging, but then it was coated in tar for added strength and protection from the elements. Running rigging is the cordage used to control the shape and position of the sails. These materials have evolved from manila rope to synthetic fibers, which include Dacron, nylon, and Kevlar. Gradually, horsepower and then steam power took over from hand twisting. Fitler's machines became so efficient that he could finish and deliver a complete gang of rigging suited for the largest vessel in the government marine, more than 10 miles of various sizes of rope, within 3 days after he received the order. During needed expansions, Fitler ran into a string of bad luck, but he kept pushing forward. He saw that for want of a mill that possessed improved machinery, trade from the South and West was passing through Philadelphia to the New York and other Eastern manufactories. He urged partners the needs for a factory that could compete with any in the United States, and he built it, and 10 days later it was destroyed by fire. Another and larger factory was immediately erected on the former site, Germantown Road near Turner's Lane. This burnt down in July of 1866. Within 4 months, another mill was erected in accordance with plans drawn by Mr. Fitler, and it became the finest and most conveniently arranged cordage factory in the United States. The main building was brick, 3 stories high, 184 feet long, and 58 feet wide. There was a nearby engine room which contained, besides the engine, 2 steam fire pumps, a boiler room, and a machine shop 24 by 46 feet. Extending at right angles from the factory was a 1,300-foot-long rope walk, a quarter of a mile. About 300 men worked in the factories, which consumed each day from 60 to 70 bales of Manila, Russian, and American hemp, and produced about 7 tons of rope and cordage daily, or 4,500,000 pounds per annum. Fitler established a private telegraphic wire from the store on Water Street to the factory. The wire passed directly through his house in the city, by means of which not only orders and business reports, but private and domestic messages could be transmitted by telegraph. The system that he organized was so complete that the affairs of a vast and complicated business were managed with a minimum of trouble and labor. Sometimes he didn't even have to leave the house. Every evening, an amount of the various kinds of hemp on hand was taken, and the quantity of the different sizes of rope in store was made up. And thus, every morning, Fitler had a complete and exact report of the state of affairs ready for his guidance during the day. Agricultural machinery pioneer William Deering came to Fitler in 1878. He explained what he needed for this new reaping and binding machine that he had invented. From the unassuming way in which Deering stated his needs, Fitler concluded the order would be a small one. "What you want," he said, "is a single-strand twine, which cannot be made without a new line of machinery. I regret to say I cannot afford to do this for one customer." "Well," said Deering, "I think I may need a good deal in the long run, though I wish to begin with not more than 10 carloads. For a moment, Fitler was dazed, but only for a moment. Years afterward, he was fond of telling how he, quote, "made $1 million deal with William Deering in 2 minutes," end quote. Binder twine soon grew to be one of the most important parts of the cordage industry. How else did people use Fitler's ropes? Well, professional hangmen considered them the finest around, and they tried to use Fitler ropes when possible because they knew there was virtually no chance that one would break. A dedicated worker named Godfrey Boger was the hangman's rope maker, and he never once saw a live execution. By custom, though, the company never charged for execution ropes, only for the cost of delivery. Bad luck to sell somebody a hangman's rope. In some cultures, hangman's ropes are believed to be a cure for sore eyes or fits and headaches. That was actually in Pennsylvania, and ague in London. In Russia, a hangman's rope brought luck to gamblers, and a rope used by a victim of suicide was specified to treat epilepsy in Pennsylvania and India. Fitler became one of the most successful and best-known businessmen of his time. He was noted for his keen perceptions and the rapidity and correctness of his decisions. He was repeatedly elected president of the American Cordage Manufacturers Association. He was a good and a fair boss, and his relations with his employees were always cordial. It is said that he never had labor troubles in his plant, and the workers never saw a need to strike. Fitler was also intensely patriotic and pro-union. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he threw the whole weight of his influence into the Union cause and even personally outfitted the company from his employees, although there's next to nothing about him in the newspapers of the day. He was an early proponent of the Union League. He served as that organization's president in 1891-92, after he'd served as vice president from 1880 to 1890. He took an active part in the work of projecting and organizing the Centennial Exposition, and in 1875-76 he was a member of its Board of Finance. He was also one of the founders of the Philadelphia Art Club. Despite encouragement from many, Fitler managed to avoid public office until 1887. Finally, he was pushed to run for mayor of the city, and on Tuesday, February 15th, he was elected by nearly 30,000 majority in a city that was approaching a population of 1 million. He was the first mayor under the new charter, the so-called Bullitt Bill, which was named for John Christian Bullitt, who's interred in Section P at Laurel Hill East. You can also see his statue outside of City Hall. During Fitler's administration, many reforms were instituted and many improvements were made in all branches of the city government. He was also the first mayor to conduct business from the mostly completed new City Hall. Because of the new workspace and the new charter, it was Fitler's job to organize several new departments and bureaus in the city. He rapidly won the confidence of the entire community. At the 1888 Republican National Convention in Chicago, Edwin Fitler received the vote of the entire Philadelphia delegation and several delegates from other parts of Pennsylvania and a few from other states as their choice for President of the United States. His 24 votes left him far behind the favored candidates John Sherman of Ohio and the eventual nominee and winner Benjamin Harrison, so he withdrew after the first round. After he stepped down from the mayor's office in 1891, he again devoted himself to his business. For instance, he was director of the National Bank of the Northern Liberties. In 1896, Edwin Fitler died after a long illness at his country estate in Torresdale, near Philadelphia. His wife, the former Josephine Baker, outlived him by a decade, and she died in 1906. He left behind 4 sons and a daughter. One of the sons, William Wonderly Fitler, had a son who he named William Jr., who grew up to marry Margaretta Large Harrison Bartol. In 1926, that couple gave birth to Margaretta Large Fitler, who grew up to be Happy Rockefeller, second wife of former New York governor and 41st Vice President of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller. She is interred in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Shortly after Fitler's death, the city dedicated a half-acre public park between 23rd and 24th and Panama and Pine as Fitler Square in his honor. The neighborhood surrounding the park has taken on that same name. The city also dedicated Edwin Fitler School. If you visited Laurel Hill East, you know that the newest central section is spiked with obelisks. This section came into being at about the same time the country was fascinated by the long-delayed completion of the Washington Monument in D.C. The obelisk is the Egyptian symbol of eternal life and the ancient sun god Ra. Definition of an obelisk, quote, a tall, four-sided, narrow, tapering monument which ends in a pyramid-like shape at the top and is said to resemble a petrified ray of the sun disk. End quote. And yet the word obelisk is not Egyptian. It's a Greek word, since the Greek traveler Herodotus was one of the first classical writers to describe the object. The Egyptians usually erected obelisks in pairs at the entrance to their temples. Well, obelisks started to overrun the central section, and when Laurel Hill published its 1886 Rules and Regulations of the Laurel Hill Cemetery of Philadelphia, it cautiously inserted this paragraph on page 18. It has been the frequent remark of visitors, our own citizens as well as strangers, that a monotony already begins to be apparent in the style and form of the improvements. Obelisk succeeds obelisk, etc., with only slight variation. And if this is continued, we shall see in time too dull a uniformity to strike the mind with agreeable sentiments. This may be obviated by a little inquiry before ordering a monument, and by not always taking only the advice of the artisan, often himself willing to suggest the greatest bulk for the least money, and thus allowing marble to usurp the place of good taste. Despite this admonishment, the obelisk that sits in its own circle and pierces the sky today was erected more than 20 years after it was published and belongs to Edwin Fitler. It has its own plot of land, and there's a pointed column that proudly stands 55 feet tall, 1/10 scale model of the Washington Monument. It stands in tribute to one of the greatest mayors in Philadelphia history. Laura Matilda Towne, 1825-1901, teaching the least fortunate. On May 3, 1825, Laura Matilda Towne was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the fourth child of John and Sarah Towne. Her father had grown up in Topsfield, Massachusetts, her mother in Coventry, England. Laura's mother died when she was about 7, and the family moved to John Towne's native Massachusetts, where they settled in Boston. Like her siblings, Laura received a Boston education. After several years, the family moved back to Pennsylvania, this time to Philadelphia, where her eldest brother had reestablished himself in business. She had been introduced to abolitionism during her time in Boston, and Laura enthusiastically fell under the influence of the minister of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, Reverend William Henry Fitler, who was interred at Laurel Hill East. Although he was not a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, Reverend Fitler emulated the passion of his friend and most renowned abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison of Boston and fellow Philadelphians James and Lucretia Mott. The intensity of Fitler's anti-slavery sermons increased throughout the 1840s and into the 1850s, despite friction within his congregation. Initially, he urged moral suasion and then finally outright defiance against elements of the Southern, quote, slaveocracy, such as the Fugitive Slave Act. When Preston Brooks beat Massachusetts abolitionist Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, Sumner spent much of his recuperation time with Fitler in Philadelphia. Under the leadership of Reverend Fitler, both personal and professional, Laura Towne's zest for abolitionism grew. She had a love of nature and a compassion for both man and animal. Towne intermittently attended the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania in the late 1850s. There, she studied under Dr. Constantine Herring, who's interred at Laurel Hill West, although she never finished her education. Dr. Herring later maintained that Laura could easily have attained a degree in homeopathic medicine, but the war effort distracted her, leading to other ventures. Nonetheless, Towne's knowledge of medicine would aid her tremendously in the future. When the Civil War broke out, Laura Towne was living in a boarding house in Newport, Rhode Island. It was run by the mother of her closest friend, Ellen Murray. Towne desperately wanted to aid the war effort. While teaching school, she joined the Women's Aid Society and sewed uniforms for soldiers. She even considered serving in Union hospitals, but she knew she had two strikes against her: her homeopathic background and her gender. The regular scientific medical establishment frowned upon the practice of homeopathy and viewed it as quackery, deception, avarice, falsehood, blasphemy, witchcraft, and almost every other conceivable wickedness and folly. Homeopathic therapy was based on the notion that a disease could be cured by minute diluted doses of drugs that in full produced effects similar to the symptoms exhibited. Women themselves had just begun to make headway in the medical profession. Elizabeth Blackwell had graduated from Geneva Medical College in 1849 and was the first American woman physician. With service in medicine unpromising, by 1861, Towne had begun to feel restless and, quote, not a bit contented, end quote. Finally, in the spring of 1862, Laura Towne's fortunes took a new turn and offered an opportunity that would change her life. In early April, she received a commission from the Port Royal Relief Committee of Philadelphia, PRRC, to set sail for the South Carolina Sea Islands. The PRRC had formed to send supplies, provisions, and educators to teach freed slaves the, quote, habits of self-support, end quote, and to, quote, elevate their moral and social condition, end quote. Laura Towne was among the first chosen from Pennsylvania to take part in this cause. Seizing the opportunity, on April 9th, she embarked on the steamer Oriental. During the voyage, she carefully characterized the anti-slavery sentiments of her fellow passengers in her journal, recording several thoughts about each, but for herself she used just one telling word: abolitionist. This part of the script is taken from the introduction to the book Letters and Diary of Laura M. Towne, 1862 to 1884. It was written by Rupert Sargent Holland. I am going to read this text as it was written, so there are certain words and terms that are no longer used or considered correct. Please understand that. This is a long quote. The opening shot of the Civil War was fired by the Confederate States on April 12, 1861. 3 days later, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. At that time, Ms. Laura M. Towne was living in Newport, Rhode Island. She was intensely stirred by the news and her hopes set on helping the cause of the Union. For a month or two, she found employment in sewing for the soldiers, and then she planned to engage in hospital service. Finally, there came her golden opportunity. The federal government wanted to send agents to the Sea Islands of South Carolina to take charge of the Negroes. Miss Towne volunteered, and acting under instructions from the Philadelphia abolitionists, sailed on the steamer Oriental from New York for Port Royal on April 9, 1862. The Port Royal Islands lies about 55 miles south of Charleston, 35 miles north of Savannah. To its east are clustered a group of little islands on which is grown some of the best cotton in the South. The nearest is Ladies Island, and to the southeast of that lies St. Helena Island, about 15 miles long and 6 wide. Between it and the Atlantic Ocean are several small wooded strips of sand, collectively known as the Hunting Islands, the home of a few lighthouse keepers, and serving the very useful purpose of a buffer between St. Helena and the winter storms. To reach St. Helena, the usual route is from the old town of Beaufort on Port Royal to Ladies Island, across that, and over a narrow tide river to St. Helena. Edisto lies a few miles to the north, and Hilton Head guards the entrance to the islands on the south. The Confederates had built 2 earth forts on Hilton Head and Bay Point, which was opposite the former place on Phillips Island. These were taken by Commodore DuPont on November 7, 1861, and as a result of the fighting, known as the Battle of Port Royal, that place, including the town of Beaufort and the Sea Islands, became Union territory. The planters instantly fled, and the federal government found on its hands at once several thousand freed Negroes, perhaps the most helpless of their race, used to the domination of white and black overseers, and a large crop of cotton of the finest and longest fiber, and of considerable value at any time. Cotton agents were hurried down from the north, and during the winter the Secretary of the Treasury sent Edward L. Pierce of Massachusetts as a special agent to look after the Negroes and ensure another cotton crop for the ensuing year. Mr. Pierce proved energetic and efficient. He wrote to friends in Boston that the Negroes were in great need of teachers and of clothing, and as a result, the Educational Commission for Freedmen was organized in Boston, and very soon afterwards similar societies were formed in Philadelphia and New York. Each of these societies sent its own teachers to the South, paid them salaries ranging from $25 to $50 a month. The federal government, for its part, making them an allowance for transportation, housing, and subsistence. Miss Towne went as an agent of the Freedmen Aid Society of Pennsylvania. It took courage in these northern men and women to volunteer for such work in the Sea Islands. The climate was known to be unhealthy. Smallpox periodically claimed its scores of victims. The Confederates had only retreated a short distance inland. They might at any time return in force. Finally, they were going to a region peopled entirely by Negroes, concerning whom they knew very little, and who might regard the newcomers with suspicion. Whatever the condition of the Negroes elsewhere, it had been hard in reality in the Sea Islands. The cotton there was an imperious crop, requiring a full year's labor to prepare for market. The drivers had to be severe. The slaves had been allowed no holidays except Christmas and Sundays. no rest but a few hours at night, and that shortened on Saturdays by the need of grinding at the hand mill the weekly ration of 1 peck of corn, turn and turn about, until daylight. The older ones were dulled with incessant labor. The younger had had no chance to learn anything. Miss Towne says they could count no farther than 10, and that they did in this fashion: 1, 2, 5, 8, 10. Many still kept the superstitions of their ancestors, shown in their belief in gooferdocks and in the religious services called shouts. The houses were of rough boards with small windows without glass. The floors were made of sand and lime. At one side was an open hearth. In spite of doors and shutters, large cracks let in the bitter winter cold. The older people slept in bunks, the younger on the floor. The cooking utensils usually consisted of a single pot. The food was hominy, or peas and salt pork. Long oyster shells were used for spoons, and when the family had scraped the hominy from the pot, the dogs were allowed to clean it for the next meal. Such conditions were little short of those in a savage settlement on the Congo, yet these northern teachers, almost as ignorant of the Sea Island Negroes as of Native Americans, had come to teach them how to live and how to work intelligently. It is hard to overestimate such courage and such patience. The letters and the diary show the enthusiasm and the faith with which Miss Towne and her associates attacked the problem. Fortunately for her, Miss Ellen Murray, her intimate friend, soon joined her at St. Helena. Miss Towne was busy on every hand. She had to distribute clothing and supplies, to doctor many different ailments, to show the people that the newcomers were really their friends. Then there was the constant arrival of federal soldiers with news of the war, the appearance of refugee slaves from other parts of the South, and the daily batches of rumors concerning the return of the old masters. These cares occupied all her time. Very soon, the Negroes lost all mistrust of the new white people, confided in them, and showed themselves as they really were, children of happy, easygoing dispositions, good-natured in spite of all their misery, faithful to anyone who would be kind to them. That first year was a hard one. An epidemic of smallpox broke out, and many of Miss Towne's friends among the Union officers advised her and Miss Murray to go north. Many of the agents who had volunteered in the winter gave up the labor by summer, discouraged by the unpromising condition of the Negroes and the hardship of their surroundings. But Miss Towne held on to her work. Miss Murray and she found time to teach some of the children at the Oaks Plantation, the government headquarters where they were living. And in September 1862, they opened a school in the brick church with some 80 scholars. Miss Towne said of them, "They had no idea of sitting still, of giving attention, of ceasing to talk aloud. They lay down and went to sleep. They scuffed and struck each other. They got up by the dozen, made their curtsies, and walked off to the neighboring field for blackberries, coming back to their seats with a curtsy when they were ready. They evidently did not understand me, and I could not understand them. And after 2 hours and a half of effort, I was thoroughly exhausted." Later, the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Association sent a schoolhouse in sections. This was put up opposite the brick church, and it was christened the Penn School. Government superintendents came and went. New officers were put in charge of the Port Royal district. The war continued with varying success for 3 more years. But Miss Towne and Miss Murray stayed at St. Helena. They were more than teachers. They had become a very providence to the people. When the epidemics raged, the 2 women went fearlessly from cabin to cabin, tending patients who had not the slightest notion how to care for themselves. Sickness decreased. Crops were husbanded carefully. Families learned how to save something from their earnings. and these home lessons taught by the Northern women were no less important than those instilled in the schoolroom. The old plantation owners did not come back, and the federal government, having handled the crops for more than a year, and realizing that the people must be provided with homes, finally sold the estates for unpaid taxes. Eventually, the proceeds of the sale, less the taxes, were paid over to the Southern owners. The government bought the land, divided into 10-acre farms, and sold these on easy terms to the Negroes. The former slaves now became actual real estate owners with a valuable stake in the community, and at once began to develop thrift and responsibility. Protected from the excitements of the mainland by their isolated position, they rapidly became home-loving and home-keeping, and showed that a race which had had no chance at all could, with fair treatment, grow into law-abiding, decent men and women. After a number of years, Miss Towne bought the old house and estate of Frogmore on the eastern shore of St. Helena, and there she and Miss Murray made their permanent home, only taking infrequent holiday trips to their families in the north. With the end of the war came new troubles for South Carolina. The era of the carpetbaggers set in, and the machinations of greedy politicians kept ill feeling rife. We read in the letters how these stormy waves swept out to St. Helena, how the Negroes learned to cast their ballots, and how Port Royal became for a second time the scene of unrest. To Miss Towne, living there, indignation and resentment would naturally be uppermost. If these feelings speak in her letters, let them speak. Erase the feelings of a stirring era, and you erase human nature out of it. When the wounds of war and its aftermath were healed, new difficulties rose. Many of those in the North who had been willing and eager to help free the Negro grew lukewarm toward him when that cause was won. Their support was needed for interests nearer home, and the old Freedmen's Relief Association languished and died. Miss Towne had to fight to keep her school. She had to use her own money to pay the teachers. Time and again it looked as if the work must be abandoned, but it survived until at length, by dint of her own efforts and the help of a few devoted Northern friends, its existence became an assured fact. The Sea Islands, a flat, marshy, storm-swept country to Northern eyes, have a beauty of their own. Live oaks hung with the silvery gray moss festoon the sandy roads. Tall palmettos raise their shapely heads. Wide, many-tinted marshes lure the eye. The spring comes early. The end of March sees the wisterias, the wild white lilies, the last yellow jessamine, and the first Cherokee roses. The mistress of Frogmore delighted in nature's gifts. She loved the roses and violets, the azaleas and daffodils, the red-clad oleanders and the myrtles. These she speaks of often in her letters. The place grew less and less barren to her every year, and its beauties more sufficient. Chief satisfaction of all, the people whom she came to teach justified her faith and her perseverance. She saw the children who had seemed so unpromising at first grow out of superstition and into knowledge, and make the Sea Islands many times more prosperous than before. She knew that her school at least had proved that the Negro could profit by an education, and needed only fair play to justify his right to independence. She was assured of this long before she gave over active teaching. She died in 1901. Such was Miss Towne's work, growing slowly out of love and patience. She came to a land of doubt and trouble, and led the children to fresh horizons and a clearer sky. The school she built is but a symbol of the great influence. There it stands, making the desert blossom, and bidding coming generations look up and welcome ever-widening opportunities. Through it, she brought hope to a people and gave them the one gift that is beyond all price to men. The value of this diary and these letters lies in the personal note. They should be read as the story of a pioneer. It was no light task to leave home and friends to volunteer for service during wartime. It was even less light to stay in such service when the excitement was over and only the work remained. None but a spirit heroic in steadfastness could achieve such success. Yet heroism was not in Miss Towne's thoughts, simply the conviction that this was the work allotted her to do. We must read between the lines to complete the picture. The structure of daily incidents and thoughts is there. We could build the full life only if we read events with sympathy and understanding. Signed, Rupert Sargent Holland. By the end of November 1865, 48 schools were in operation, 4 in Charleston, 5 at St. Helena, 5 at Hilton Head, 5 at Columbia, and the remainder scattered along the coastal area. More than 5,000 students were enrolled under the guidance of 76 teachers, of whom 49 were Northerners and 27 native Negroes. Indicative of the task that lay ahead was the fact that 23 of the state's 31 districts had not even a single school for freedmen. During the year, slow but steady progress was recorded in expanding the work until by June 1866, 54 institutions were operating with an enrollment of nearly 8,000, an average daily attendance of 5,500, and a teaching staff of 130. During the session, total expenditures for education had amounted to $72,000, the bulk of which had been supplied by benevolent associations. Not even those figures tell the complete story, however, for there were a number of unreported night and Sabbath schools, the latter offering in many instances some kind of elementary instruction. The estimate, doubtless with some exaggeration, is that at least 30,000 people of color during 1865-1866 had learned to read. Laura Matilda Towne dedicated the rest of her life to the teaching of freed, enslaved people. In 1867, Towne and Murray had purchased that former plantation on St. Helena Island named Frogmore, and they lived there for the rest of their lives. That is where Laura died on February 22, 1901, due to influenza. The Palmetto Post of Port Royal, South Carolina, gave her a nice obituary, but I found nothing in the Philadelphia newspapers. She was interred in the south section of Laurel Hill East. In addition to a stone at her gravesite, a monument was erected in the brick church graveyard on St. Helena Island in her honor. So she has 2 listings on Find a Grave. In her will, she bequeathed 6 acres of land of St. Helena's Island to Alice Lathrop of New York, her longtime companion, Ellen Murphy of Milton, Massachusetts, and Helen C. Jenks of Cheltenham. Normally what I would do now is give you a little preview of what's coming up in the tours at Laurel Hill, which would be wonderful if I knew what they were. I'm recording this on December 30th, and so far the January schedule has not been posted on the website. That kind of surprises me. I do know of one virtual tour because I'm the one who's giving it. It's on Tuesday, January 14th at 6:30 p.m. I'll be giving a virtual Hotspots and Storied Plots tour. In other words, a general introductory tour to Laurel Hill East. It's a repeat of a virtual tour I gave 4 or 5 years ago updated a little bit. Even if you watched it 4 or 5 years ago, it's worth watching again. It's got some good people. It's got some really interesting people to talk about. Also, like I say, I would normally tell you about other tours coming up, and I don't know what they are. I mean, there's going to be the usual 2 Hotspots tours and 1 Sacred Spaces and Storied Places. Those are monthly. Those are given. The 2 Hotspots at Laurel Hill and then the Sacred Spaces at Laurel Hill West. I'm going to tell you about the book. I've decided to go ahead and take scripts from the first 5 years of this podcast. Yes, we are 5 years in. We're more than 5 years in. And I'm going to convert the scripts to book chapters. And I'm hoping to put out a series of books. The first one, I do have a publisher. I'm finalizing the details right now. It's going to be 52 women from Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West that will cover the gamut. The way that I have got it set up is Section 1 is movers and shakers. Section 2 is artists, writers, and entertainers. Section 3 is scholars and educators. 4 is healers and givers. And then 5 is odds and ends. And I know it's the odds and ends that you're curious about. So let me tell you what my odds and ends are in this. I'm going to talk about Gertie Gorman, the poor little rich girl who died young, and her family thought that her husband was poisoning her. I will talk about Anna Meister, also known as Jehovah Elamar Marameta, who claimed to be the third person of the Trinity and therefore the sister of Jesus Christ. And if you followed her rules, such as not eating lemons, you could make it into heaven. I will tell the tragedy of the 3 young women, Maud Ritu and then the sister, the Merritt sisters, Bessie and Emmett, who drowned in a sudden squall on the Atlantic. That is one of the more nightmarish stories you will hear. I'll talk about May Bebbinghaus, who was a sweet young 19-year-old who was doing her Christian duty by teaching Chinese immigrants the Bible and developed a heroin habit and died of a heroin overdose. Martha Costin, the woman who invented the flares that bear her name. Ida Dixon, the golf course pioneer. Henrietta Garrett, the snuff fortune millionaire, and how those millions wreaked havoc with literally thousands of people around the world when her husband left her a fortune. And we're going to finish with somebody who has a cenotaph. Cenotaph is an empty tomb, but her name is on that stone. It says she hopes to lie here someday. Her name is Olga Demidov Trubetskoy Stover. She was a Russian princess with an attitude and a couple of unusual occupations. So, I don't know when this book is going to be out officially. They tell me probably 6 months, 8 months, certainly in time for Christmas next year, which is what I really wanted. I don't know how much it's going to cost. I'm estimating it's going to be about 400 pages, but it will be paperback only. Chris Wilhelm, the son of one of our guides, is an artist, and he's actually in art school right now. He's doing illustrations for me for the book. And I hope this is the first of, 5 books. I've got enough material for 2 books on men. I started with the women, because let's face it, the women are more interesting. They started with less, and whatever they ended up with, they earned it. They earned it. But I've got enough material for the men for 2 books. I've only got about half the material I need for a second book on women, so I'm going to put that one off. If I spread this out over 5 years, I can save that one for the 4th year or maybe even the 5th year, because one of the things I also want to do is finally get into print the letters that I wrote home from Vietnam when I was back there in 68, 69. I was a medic, an assistant battalion surgeon with Bobcats, 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Mechanized, 25th Infantry Division. We operated out of Cu Chi and Tay Ninh and Dao Tiang. I was with them for a full year, and I wrote letters home probably 3, sometimes 4 times a week My mother saved them all. My mother died in 82. And then my father died. I cleaned out the house. I took some stuff, put it in the basement, didn't look at it. About 4 years ago, I was looking for some books, some books that belonged to our great-grandfather for my cousin who is in Minnesota. And our great-grandfather, you've heard me mention him before, James Smith, who was with Sherman on his march to the sea. He was injured at the Battle of Bentonville, shot through the liver, but obviously survived. Lived another 50 years on his pension and stayed alive well enough to have offspring, and I am one of those offspring 4 generations down the line. So, look forward to it. 2 books on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, Women. 2 books on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, Men, and 1 book on Notes from Nam, the letters that I sent home from Vietnam 55 years ago or so. Anyway, so I've got to live long enough to do these things. I gotta crank out another 5 years so I can get these 5 books published, and then I'll feel like I've accomplished something at the end of my life. I've got enough accomplishments in the middle of my life to keep me happy. I really do. I got a teaching award named for me. I've got several other things that I'm pretty proud of. But now it's end of life, and I'm trying to get a whole different set of things together here. Anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble. I hope you enjoy the second half of the podcast also. Stay safe, stay well. John Rowe, 1825-1885. Death by Inferno. The name Blockley Almshouse lives in infamy in Philadelphia history. It was a poorhouse on the outskirts of town that served as a last resort for the elderly, the infirm, the mentally disturbed, and the abandoned. At the southeast corner of the University of Pennsylvania's campus in University City, where the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania and the Veterans Hospital are located today near 34th Street and Civic Center Boulevard, was Philadelphia General Hospital, formerly known as the Philadelphia Almshouse, or just Old Blockley. This public institution, like New York's Bellevue Hospital Center, was a space for the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the insane. In other words, those individuals who private hospitals have usually turned away. Because of the nature of its work and the associated issues of class and race, it's always been surrounded with a sort of moral ambiguity. Now, despite this, by the early 20th century, it was considered one of the great municipal hospitals of the world. Yet, after functioning as a space for Philadelphia's poor for 250 years, it was shut down by the Rizzo administration in 1977. Some historians argue that Philadelphia's reputation as a great medical center originated not with Pennsylvania Hospital and the University Medical School, but with the tradition started by the Philadelphia Almshouse. Originally built in 1731 at 3rd Street and Spruce Street by the Quaker group Overseers of the Poor, it predates Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. And since the Almshouse contained a hospital department prior to the creation of Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, many historians have argued that the Almshouse was the first hospital in what would become the United States. From 1765, the Overseers moved it from its original location to 9th and Spruce Streets to distance it from the developing city. And by that time, many called it the Bettering House, or the House of Correction. Yet in the antebellum period, the extent to which it was an institution that actively sought to reform individuals, as opposed to merely confining and isolating them, is questionable. Benjamin Franklin stated that, quote, the House of Corrections was the only place in which the lunatics of the city might be confined, and that it was by no means fitted for such a purpose, end quote. and the city continued to develop west and south in the early 19th century. According to a former doctor, quote, "The noise of these creatures, bereft of reason, howling like caged beasts, exerted not only an unpleasant influence on the sick, but even shocked the public ear." The almshouse needed to be moved to isolation once more. And in 1832, it was relocated to its final spot in West Philadelphia, which prior to the city's consolidation in 1854 was called Blockley Township. It's an irregularly shaped area just over 7,500 acres. Blockley Township was located on the west side of the Schuylkill River, north of Kingsessing Township. It was incorporated in 1704. Its name derived from Blockley, a parish in England, in Gloucester, from which the township's founder, William Warner, hailed. Although West Philadelphia was poised to become the city's first streetcar suburb, it was at that time still quite rural. It was a space like that of Eastern State Penitentiary, simultaneously being built in Fairmount, where the city fathers felt they could simultaneously remove, confine, punish, care for, and reform the city's population of poor, indigent, and, quote, lunatic members. Old Blockley's architect was William Strickland, one of two main designers of Eastern State Penitentiary. Strickland has a cenotaph near the gatehouse in Laurel Hill East. He's buried in the wall of the Capitol at Nashville, Tennessee, though. Old Blockley was made up of an almshouse, workhouse, charity school, hospital, and lunatic asylum. It was also like the penitentiary in that it was influenced by that facet of Enlightenment thought which stressed the malleable nature of man. Theoreticians felt that by isolating individuals and subjecting them to strict regimentation, they could be worked on and remade by both doctors and missionaries to conform to the image of health, industry, and morality to which their educators subscribed. Importantly, these theorists stressed the need to do away with corporal punishments and to get the idle poor working. The more progressive ideas and policies of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride and his revolutions in psychiatric care that I talked about in All Bones Considered, number 65, Fathers and Mothers of American Medicine, Part 4, well, Kirkbride's changes were still several years away. Now, despite the aims of these Quakers in high standing, theory and practice were often out of sync at Old Blockley. One doctor who served there shortly after the Civil War told a chilling story about corporal punishment. The damp and gloomy cells of the old almshouse on Spruce Street and the walls and subterranean vaults of the present furnished familiar demonstrations of the frightful armamentarium at their command, not indeed for restoring reason, but to scare her forever from her seat in the soul. You have but to cross the area of this enclosed square to see still the iron hooks in the floor, where they were tied down, hands and feet, the rings on the outer wall where they were chained like wild animals when led from their gloomy abode to enjoy for a little while the pure air and sunshine of heaven. There, too, may be seen the traces of blood, the marks of the teeth, as they have in their agony vainly endeavored to gnaw through the doors which restrained their liberty. And not the least horrible of these inquisitorial mechanisms, there still stands the composing chair in which the doomed lunatic was secured, his head supporting a capacious box of ice, which melting dripped its chilling contents down his person for hours together. Now, this doctor also described techniques that did little to combat idleness. I still see before me the narrow, shelterless yards of the hospital filled with a mingled crowd of gibbering lunatics, many of them wearing leather muffs, while others wandered in melancholy vacuity around their narrow prison with nothing to occupy, nothing to amuse, nothing to improve them. Finally, the facility was often overcrowded and unable to provide decent beds and food. Rotten eggs were often on the menu. Still, it was better than nothing. Old Blockley represented one of the few places the poor and indigent of Philadelphia could find some kind of shelter and relief. It is possible that many Americans first heard of this American bedlam from the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow epic poem Evangeline, which was published in 1847. If you remember, Evangeline is an Acadian girl. Acadia was a colony of New France. It was in northeastern North America, included parts of what are now the Maritime provinces, the Gaspé Peninsula, and Maine to the Kennebec River. Acadia also refers to the Acadian diaspora in southern Louisiana. People who live in Acadia are called Acadians, which in Louisiana changed to Cajuns, the more common rural American name of Acadians. Evangeline spends the poem in search of her lost love Gabriel, from whom she was separated during the expulsion of the Acadians from 1755 to 1764. And toward the end of this first American epic, after wandering for years, Evangeline finds herself in the city of brotherly love. In that delightful land which is washed by the Delaware's waters, guarding in sylvan shades the name of Penn the Apostle, stands on the banks of its beautiful stream the city he founded. There all the air is balm, and the peach is the emblem of beauty, and the streets still re-echo the names of the trees of the forest, as if they fain would appease the dryads whose haunts they molested. There from the troubled sea had Evangeline landed, an exile, finding among the children of Penn a home and a country. Evangeline takes a job at the almshouse, and she takes care of the suffering men she finds there, until one day she recognizes the face of her long-lost love, and he recognizes her. Suddenly, as if arrested by fear or a feeling of wonder, still she stood with her colorless lips apart, while a shudder ran through her frame, and forgotten, the flowerets dropped from her fingers, and from her eyes and cheeks the light and bloom of the morning. Then there escaped from her lips a cry of such terrible anguish that the dying heard it and started up from their pillows. On the pallet before her was stretched the form of an old man, long and thin, and gray were the locks that shaded his temples. But as he lay in the morning light, his face for a moment seemed to assume once more the forms of its earlier manhood. So are wont to be changed the faces of those who are dying. Hot and red on his lips still burned the flush of the fever. As if life, like the Hebrew, with blood had besprinkled its portals, that the angel of death might see the sign and pass over. Evangeline and Gabriel have their deathbed rendezvous until Evangeline, quote, pressed once more the lifeless head to her bosom. Meekly she bowed her own and murmured, Father, I thank thee. According to Longfellow, this legendary couple are still buried in Old City. Still stands the forest primeval, but far away from its shadows, side by side in their nameless graves, the lovers are sleeping. Under the humble walls of the little Catholic churchyard, in the heart of the city, they lie unknown and unnoticed. Daily, the tides of life go ebbing and flowing beside them. Thousands of throbbing hearts, where theirs are at rest and forever. Thousands of aching brains, where theirs no longer are busy. thousands of toiling hands where theirs have ceased from their labors. Thousands of weary feet where theirs have completed their journey. One of the low points in the history of Blockley took place in February of 1885, when a fire raged through the insane asylum and killed captive patients, or as they were called then, inmates. The hospital census on that February 12th was 350 women, 334 men. The next morning, the Philadelphia Inquirer's front page led with "Blockley in flames, only the walls of the insane wards standing." A fire had been started by one of the patients in a second-floor drying room. This mentally challenged patient had been encouraged and given matches by a disgruntled employee. When the dust settled and people accounted for, more than 20 male patients had died of flames or asphyxiation. Several of the sets of remains were merely charred lumps of former humanity and could be identified only because of the locked cell where their remains were found. An editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer pointed fingers in several directions. The disaster so often predicted has occurred. The preparations for burning people alive at the Blockley Almshouse, so often expiated upon in official and unofficial reports, have been tried and found to be efficient. A large number of helpless people have perished miserably because they were imprisoned behind doors with complicated locks, which took too much valuable time to open, because not one of the improved appliances for checking fire at the outset was not at hand, because there was not even an alarm box within less than a half a mile, because there was an utterly insufficient supply of water for the engines when they arrived, at least an hour late, because there was bad management everywhere. 3 days later, Laurel Hill Cemetery received a set of severely burned remains, which were identified as belonging to John Reeves, a patient at the almshouse. Interment was the next day in Lot G-137, so not far from General Hugh Mercer. Burial card 15072 in the archives is a mess. Edward T. Mott is on the top line in black ink, but it is carefully lined out in red ink, and then also in red is written John Reeves by mistake for, and then John Rowe, R-O-H, in black. Yet, when I look at the names of the victims taken from the Inquirer on the 15th, the names Mott, Reeves, and Rowe are not among them. Next burial card, 15095, dated March 10th, 1885, is for, quote, body removal of John Rowe, said to be John Reeves, to Philadelphia morgue. Now, it's a month later, and the Pittsburgh Post reported on March 24th, 1885, that, quote, when the coroner's investigation of the Blockley Almshouse fire was made, 20 bodies had been recovered, and there were 2 more that had not been accounted for. These were Sharpless Brown and John Rowe. Sharpless, by the way, is a common surname in Philadelphia. I've actually seen this name misspelled without the S as Harpless Brown, which I think is kind of funny. Anyway, the 2 that were not accounted for were Sharpless Brown and John Rowe. They were said to have strayed away. Yesterday morning, while workmen were removing the debris, part of another corpse was found among the ruins in the cellar. It is no doubt that one of the missing men. So on May 27, 1885, there is a third burial card, this one numbered 15191, for burial of John Rowe, received from Philadelphia morgue. Now, to add to the confusion of 3 burial cards, the date that's engraved on John Rowe's tombstone is March 12th, 1885. That's 1 month after the fire, 1 month after his actual death. I find no information on John Roe in any place but the 1885 Philadelphia newspapers. Searching for 30 years before his death, 20 years afterwards, I find no mention of his name in any U.S. newspaper. His death certificate says he was born in South Carolina. Laurel Hill East Cemetery weekend supervisor David Gurmai has been doing this a lot longer than I have. He came up with some more information and a theory. Rowe, R-O-H, which is misspelled in the paperwork, R-O-W-E, a couple of times, was in Blockley's Ward M. That's where the violent patients were kept. The body received by the cemetery and identified as John Reeves was John Reese. The name of Edward T. Mott, owner of the property, was accidentally written on the first burial certificate. The pre-consolidation 1850 census for Northern Liberties lists Edward T. Mott as household head, with others named Rowe under the same roof. And in 1899, 14 years after the Blockley Inferno, Lizzie Mott, daughter of Edward, purchased 5 grave markers for the family plot. Either a memory lapse or a clerical error led to the wrong date of death being inscribed. In 1902, Old Blockley changed its name to the Philadelphia General Hospital, and in 1920, it moved its 1,400 insane inmates to Byberry State Hospital in the Northeast, a more remote and isolated location than West Philadelphia. It also moved its well poor to other facilities in the city in an effort to become an outright hospital. Now, this effort saw greater specialization. New disciplines included ophthalmology, dermatology, endocrinology, radiology. In 1921, Philadelphia General was the first hospital to offer radiological care to cancer patients. And after World War II, it continued to see, quote, incredible advances in techniques and medicines, end quote. Philadelphia General Hospital evolved to be one of the most valuable medical training grounds in the country. In 1977, the administration of Mayor Frank Rizzo shut the hospital down. Rizzo claimed the city no longer had the money. It cost $12 million to run that hospital in 1975. That's an amount that many observers considered quite low. Rizzo also wanted to pull the city back from the responsibility of being involved with health care. He also argued that the cost to rebuild the deteriorating facilities would be too high, although some observers claim that politicians with an eye to shutting the facility down had allowed it to deteriorate for that purpose. Demonstrators claimed that it had been starved by city government and bled by the University of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia General Hospital is still recalled fondly by members of the medical community of a certain age. But Philadelphia, at present, remains the only large United States city without a public hospital. And as for John Roe, well, I think he's resting peacefully in Section G at Laurel Hill East. Henry Charles Lee, 1825-1909. Nobody expected the Spanish Inquisition. This is mostly taken from All Bones Considered number 18, the Calder connection from a few years ago. Henry Charles Lee is remembered today primarily for 3 things. First, he was the co-owner of Blanchard and Lee Publishers when they printed the first American edition of the classic Gray's Anatomy in 1862. Second, he researched, wrote, and published the groundbreaking History of the Inquisition in Spain, which has yet to be superseded more than 100 years after it was published. And third, he has one of the most eye-catching grave sites at Laurel Hill East Cemetery. It has a sculpture by Alexander Sterling Calder. Lee's family had made a name for itself as publishers. That's Lee spelled L-E-A. His father, Isaac Lee, 1792-1886, Laurel Hill East, Section 9, was born a Quaker, but he fought in the War of 1812 with the 24th Pennsylvania Militia. In 1821, he married Frances Ann Carey, 1799-1873, a botanist and a daughter of Irish-American publisher Matthew Carey, 1760-1839, a Philadelphian. Matthew Carey had published the first Roman Catholic Bible in the United States, along with its first atlases, including an 1802 map of Washington, D.C., that was the first to name the stretch of land west of the United States Capitol as the Mall. When Matthew retired in 1825, he left the business in the hands of his son-in-law Isaac and his son Henry Charles Carey. Isaac Lee devoted his leisure time to the study of freshwater and land mollusks, becoming a world expert conchologist. His massive collection is housed at the National Museum in Washington. In an 1829 letter to Lee, Edgar Allan Poe included a 4-line poem, which was accredited to him as simply "To Isaac Lee." It was my choice, or chance, or curse, to adopt the cause, for better or worse, and with my worldly goods and wit and soul and body worship it. The verse is lifted almost word for word from a 17th century epic poem called Hudibras, a narrative that Poe knew quite well. Henry Charles Lee was born in 1825 and named for his uncle. Henry and his brother Carey never went to school. They were rigorously tutored together and established their study and writing habits early. Between 1841 and 1847, in his late teens and early 20s, Henry published more than a dozen articles on practical chemistry, botany, geology, and conchology. He started collecting books early, and not just works on the natural sciences, but literature, poetry, along with the history of philosophy, and all of it in the original languages. Between 1843 and 1846, Lee published several dozen articles on various literary subjects, including an unpublished volume of poetry, which he wrote under the name H. Carter Layton. His activities caught up with him in 1847. He had a breakdown, a physical and mental breakdown, at age 22. His physician, who sounds like he probably studied with Silas Ware Mitchell, told him to stop scientific research and do no writing for 10 years. Lee did this reluctantly. He did take time to catalog his library in 1849, and he married his first cousin, Anna Caroline Jowden, 1824 to 1912, in 1850. By 1851, he was a partner in the publishing firm, now known as Blanchard and Lee. In 1852, his brother Carey married Anna's sister Elizabeth Jowden, 1827 to 1881. Now, Henry may have been forbidden to write, but he could read. He began to mine memoirs of court life in 17th and 18th century France and acquired everything he could, going earlier and earlier. He read them chronologically backwards until he found himself in the 13th century. He was reading about the Fourth Crusade that was called by Pope Innocent III to recapture Jerusalem, held by Muslims. By 1860, Henry Charles Lee's library had grown to around 2,000 volumes. This would increase tenfold by the time he died, nearly 50 years later. He continued to run the publishing company. In 1862, Blanchard and Lee purchased publishing rights to Gray's Anatomy and put out the first of 25 distinct American editions. The first 5 editions were edited by Richard James Dungleson, 1834 to 1901, who's buried at Laurel Hill East in Section N. His father, Robley Dungleson, was physician to Thomas Jefferson. I talked about him in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 17. Fathers of American Medicine, Part 1. During the Civil War, Lee worked enthusiastically and tirelessly for the Union cause. He was a founder of the Union League of Philadelphia. He wrote thousands of pages in newspapers and pamphlets on behalf of the Union, and he received letters of thanks from President Abraham Lincoln. When William Blanchard retired from the firm in 1865 after 32 years, the publishing company simply became Lee. Henry's sons, Francis Henry Lee, 1851 to 1902, Laurel Hill East, Section S, and Arthur Henry Lee, 1859-1939, Laurel Hill West, Plymouth Section. When they took over the company in 1880, it became Lee Brothers, probably most famous for convincing William Osler to write his magnum opus, The Principles and Practice of Medicine, in 1892. Lee Brothers remained with that name until 1907, when Arthur Henry joined with Christian Febiger to form the partnership of Lee and Febiger, with its offices on the west side of Washington Square in what became known as Publishers Row. The building, constructed in 1925, has been the site of the Locke's Gallery since 1990. And for the past 20 years or so, Lee and Febiger has been part of the vast publishing conglomerate Wolters Kluwer under the Lippincott, Williams, and Wilkins imprint. The final American version of Gray's Anatomy was the 30th edition. It was printed in 1990. As early as 1868, Henry Charles Lee took an interest in the Spanish Inquisition. In 1869, when he built a new house at 2000 Walnut Street, it included 2 rooms built solely to accommodate his ever-growing library and his workspace for historical research. 12 years later, he expanded that house, and he added a reading room, but it was at the expense of his garden. This is where he did the bulk of his research. It was also about this time that British politician Benjamin Disraeli complained, "If Mr. Lee is not stopped, all the libraries of Europe will be removed to Philadelphia." It was in this added room that Lee wrote his last great works, including The History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages in 3 volumes in 1888, chapters from the religious history of Spain connected with the Inquisition in 1890, and the masterwork, History of the Inquisition of Spain, 4 volumes, 1906-1908. During the same period, he also compiled several volumes of essays incidental to the larger projects, and he began his final unfinished project, The History of Magic and Witchcraft, which was published only partly and posthumously by Arthur C. Howland in 1939. When he did not have the references that he needed and he couldn't purchase them, he borrowed them from European libraries, and they gladly sent them. The Bodleian Library at Oxford sent its own original manuscripts, as did libraries of the universities of Ghent, Halle, and Munich. The Royal Library of Copenhagen sent him the Moldenauer Codex, which he copied and used extensively. In addition to his research and publishing, Lee stayed active in local and national politics, especially pushing for political reform. In the words of one historian, Henry Charles Lee became the first mugwump. A mugwump is a Republican who bolted from the party due to the financial corruption of James Blaine. Lee strongly opposed the building of City Hall at the Penn Square location. He preferred it instead be built at Washington Square near Independence Hall. In 1884, he and others filed a lawsuit to prevent a large slaughterhouse from being built at 30th and Spruce by the Schuylkill River. He opposed the construction of the Market Street elevated train. He fought against the Grand Boulevard from City Hall northwest to Fairmount Park. He was chosen president of the National Republican League in 1880. And he was elected president of the American Historical Society in 1903, despite having had no formal training as a historian. Shortly before Lee's death, Professor Dana Carlton Munro asked him why he did not write his autobiography. Replied the old man, "As regards an autobiography, I'm like Canning's knife grinder. Story? Lord bless you, sir, I've none to tell. I only followed my convictions and worked as they led." He was referring to a poem by George Canning, 1770-1827, called Friend of Humanity. Henry Charles Lee died of pneumonia at home at age 84 in October 1909. He was a very wealthy man. Despite having had no formal education, he became one of the most respected historians in the world and received numerous honorary degrees, both here and abroad. Crates of documents and books continued to arrive at his Walnut Street home for several months after his death. He was laid to rest a few days later at Laurel Hill East, Section S. 3 years later, architect Frank Furness was buried just a few feet away. Lee's tomb is one of the most impressive in the cemetery. It has a 1911 Beaux-Arts bronze sculpture by Alexander Sterling Calder showing the muse of history, Cleo. Cleo is sitting erect. She has an upright book on her lap. She's staring straight ahead toward the Schuylkill River. Now, this was 9 years before Sterling started on the Swan Fountain. The Art Nouveau wall behind Cleo is by the architects Clarence Zanziger and Louis Borey, Jr., who had just shared a commission with Horace Trumbauer for the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They also did the Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge National Historical Park and the Edward Bach Singing Tower in Lake Wales, Florida. Over Cleo's right shoulder on the wall is inscribed Henry Charles Lee, Historian. Over her left shoulder is a Latin phrase, Veritatem Dilexi, I delight in the truth. This has also been the motto of Bryn Mawr College since 1903. As you go up the steps to the left of the statue, look at the bottom of the book spine, and you will see Calder's name, essentially his signature. So where did Henry Lee's library go? He made no provision in his will, so his children had to decide what to do with 20,000 historically important books. In 1888, Lee had paid for the Library Company of Philadelphia to double its capacity, so that might have been his intended choice. But while he was a trustee at the University of Pennsylvania from 1871 to 73, he had made extensive gifts to both the library and the museum. In 1892, he had also donated the Henry C. Lee Library and Reading Room to the School of Medicine for the study of public health. The Lee children decided on Penn, but the Furness Library, which had been dedicated in 1891 and held the university's library, had no space for the Lee Library. So the family financed a new wing for $100,000. It was completed in 1924, just in time for his centennial celebration. They also endowed the Henry Charles Lee Chair in History at Penn, as well as chairs in history in Lee's name at Princeton and Harvard. And when the Van Pelt Library was built in 1962, the Lee Professor of History, Kenneth M. Seton, was also the Director of Libraries and saw to it that the Lee Library, paneling, bookcases, skylight, doors, fireplace, furnishings, as well as the Furness Shakespeare Library and other special collections, were moved to the 6th floor of the new building, where they remain today. By the way, that Furness Shakespeare Library is from Horace Howard Furness, not from his kid brother, Frank. The Lee Professor of History remains curator of the Lee collection at the library to this day.
I was always
For the mid-January edition of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories number 40, I'm going to tell you about 3 professional football players at Laurel Hill West. McRoy Jackson played in the first professional football all-star game in the 1890s. Later in life, he became a horse breeder, dog breeder, master of hounds, and even married a Rockefeller. Nate Ramsey spent 9 years with the Eagles and was one of their steadiest players despite occasional brushes with the law. Herb Lusk spent 3 seasons with the Eagles after they drafted him from Long Beach State College. With the nickname the Praying Tailback, he retired from football and became a minister. In February's All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories number 71, Black History Month, more black leaders and innovators. All from Laurel Hill West this time. Linwood Blunt was a World War II veteran who became one of the more respected municipal judges during his time on the bench. Reverend Leonard Small spent much of his career as pastor at Graterford Prison. Jack Jones was one of Philadelphia's first black TV announcers who died far too young. And another judge, Doris May Harris, spent her time in family court. I will try to cover all 4. I have not done any deep research on any of them yet, so I don't know what I'm going to find. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's an easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge and Allegheny for SEPTA buses R, 1, and 61. Admission is free, as is parking in the lot across the street. All those spaces are quite limited. You can also pull onto the grounds and park where you know you won't be blocking anyone. There's an app you can download for a self-guided tour through its 78 acres. Laurel Hill West is at 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala Cynwyd. There's parking at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Public transportation, SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk, or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue. And then you cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid pedestrian bridge, come up the Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. I have done a couple of audios for self-guided tours at West. They are 45 minutes long, and they follow the bike paths. Either come in at Barmouth and go to Pencoid, or Pencoid and walk to Barmouth. And there is a recording that will tell you about, 30 or 40 people, I guess, on each one. And just as you walk through, you're not going to have to get off the road very much at all. Both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West are currently open from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. We welcome pretty much everyone: dog walkers, bike riders, photographers, painters, bird watchers, nature buffs, tree and plant lovers, skateboarders, strollers. If you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you'll get a daily reminder of our inhabitants and activities. You can also follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook. Once you've fallen in love with these hotspots, become a friend of Laurel Hill. You'll have the opportunity for several members-only special tours conducted each year, including some inside the mausoleum visits. They may be cemeteries, but they are a couple of the liveliest spots in town. The key to finding the gift shop online is to click on Support, find the gift shop in the left-hand column. Our theme song, Knaves at Peace, was written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories are researched, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University. You can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Remember to keep body and soul together until next time on All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories, where the plot always thickens. Stick around to hear the references that I use for this podcast. And until the next time we meet, stay safe, stay well, try to stay above ground. Bibliography's coming up next. I didn't find a lot about Thomas Craycroft. He didn't really live long enough to make a big impression, I guess. What I did find was general information, nothing specific about him. online from archive.net. You can find a report of the Philadelphia Relief Committee appointed to collect funds for the sufferers by yellow fever in Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, 1855. Printed Philadelphia. The Inquirer Printing Office, 57 South 3rd Street. Other thing I used for that was the book The Fever, the Most Fatal Plague in American History. And that title you would have thought might have been overcome by the flu of 1918, 1919, or COVID in 2020-21. But this is a book that was copyrighted this year. And he's still calling it the most fatal plague in American history. Lon Wagner is the author on this book, which is from Virginia Beach, Cape Charles, Kohler Books, Koehlerbookes. I wonder if this is a self-publishing. I didn't check that out. I will say this about the book. It has no index in it. And I'm sorry, if you write a history book, please put an index in it. Otherwise, I'm just flipping through page to page, hoping that I see a name that is familiar. For Laura Matilda Towne, several nice articles. The Freedmen's Bureau and Negro Schooling in South Carolina by Martin Abbott. It's from the South Carolina Historical Magazine, April 1956, volume 57, number 2, pages 65 to 81. There's the Yankee Schoolmarm in Freedmen's Schools, an analysis of attitudes. Author on that is Sandra E. Small. From the Journal of Southern History, August 1979, volume 45, number 3, pages 381 to 402. Laura M. Towne and the Freed People of South Carolina, 1862-1901. Author is Kurt with a K. J. Wolf. South Carolina Historical Magazine, October 1997, volume 98, number 4, pages 375 to 405. And then from the collection of a family member, Henry Towne, we have a book that's called The Letters and Diary of Laura M. Towne, written from the Sea Islands of South Carolina, 1862 to 1854, edited by Rupert Sargent Holland, and printed at the Riverside Press, Cambridge, 1912. I'm going to assume that's Cambridge, Massachusetts, and not Cambridge, England. For Fitler, I got most of my information from the newspapers. Also did a lot of research on the cordage business, picking what I thought was interesting from Wikipedia and a few other sources. But there wasn't one major source I used for Edwin Fitler. John Rowe, of course, was all newspapers from 1885. There's a book that I found interesting called Blockley Days, Memories and Impressions of a Resident Physician, 1883 to 1884, by Arthur Ames Bliss, A.M.M.D., printed for private circulation. It's the MCM XVI, what's that, 1916. That was copyright 1916 by Laura Newhouse Bliss. And the other one is From Almshouse to Hospital, The Shaping of Philadelphia General Hospital by Charles E. Rosenberg. That's from the Millbank Memorial Fund Quarterly, Health and Safety, Winter 1982, volume 60, number 1, pages 108 to 154. Come back next month for more. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the podcast. And tell your friends if you really like All Bones Considered. I'd appreciate it. It looks like the listenership is sort of stalling right now. I'd like to see it bump up a little bit. Although we're very close to 60,000 total downloads, which is not too bad for an amateur podcast done by an amateur historian. So thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.